In the spring of 1241, something happened that terrified Europe more than plague, famine, or civil war. Entire armies vanished, not retreated, not surrendered. Vanished, swallowed by something that moved faster than any messenger could ride to warn the next city. And the cities that did get warning, they still burned. Refugees came pouring westward, half-starved, eyes hollow, carrying the same words in a dozen different languages. The Mongols are coming.
Kings didn't believe it at first.
They'd heard stories before, rumors from distant borders, from exaggerated reports from people who'd never actually seen what they were describing. This felt like that. It didn't feel like that for long, because the armies they sent to check didn't come back. And now a question was spreading through the courts and cathedrals of Europe. Quietly, at first. Then louder, then impossible to ignore. Was this the end? Tonight, we're going inside the story of the army that brought the most powerful continent on Earth to its knees. How they moved, how they thought, and how close, uncomfortably, terrifyingly close, they came to erasing everything. But you need to understand where this started.
In 1206, a man named Temujin did something no one on the Mongolian steppe had ever managed to do before. He made the tribes stop killing each other. He united them under one banner and gave himself a new name, Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. What he built over the following decades wasn't just an empire. It was a machine. Disciplined, fast, engineered from the ground up to break every enemy it touched, not just militarily, but psychologically, before the first arrow ever left the first bow. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, his empire was already the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Here's what most people get wrong about that moment. They assume it was the peak. That after the founder dies, things slow down, the machine runs out of fuel, the generals start fighting each other. The whole thing gradually collapses. That's what usually happens. Not here. His son Urgide took over and kept the engine running. His generals, men who had campaigned alongside Genghis for decades, men who had never tasted defeat, were still in the field. The momentum wasn't just alive, it was hungry. And then in 1235, the Mongol Grand Council made a decision that would reshape half the world. They voted to move west. The man chosen to command the Western armies was Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, a prince with the right bloodline and the political authority to hold the campaign together. But the real architect of what was about to happen was someone else. A general so tactically gifted that historians, centuries later, comparing notes across every military tradition in history, would struggle to name anyone better. His name was Subutai. He was 60 years old. He had campaigned across 3 decades and multiple continents. He had never lost a major engagement, not once. Europe had never heard of him. That was exactly the problem. Before Subutai moved a single soldier, he spent years learning. Not guessing, learning. He sent men into Eastern Europe, disguised as merchants, travelers, pilgrims. They came back with information on roads, river depths, seasonal flood patterns, which princes hated, which neighboring kings, where the grain stores were, which cities had walls, and which ones only thought they had walls. Subutai read all of it. He built a picture of a continent that had no idea it was being studied. By 1237, he decided he knew enough. The Rus principalities, the medieval kingdoms stretching across what is now Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus were first. And the speed of what happened there was almost impossible to process in real time. Vladimir fell. Suzdal fell. Ryazan fell. Each city faster than the last. The Mongols didn't just defeat these places, they erased them. One account describes soldiers moving through the streets of a fallen city and having to climb over the bodies because there were too many to walk around. The survivors fled west. And what they carried wasn't just trauma. It was information, the worst kind. Stories that started factual and became legend with every retelling. By the time those stories reached Poland and Hungary, the Mongols had become something between an army and a natural disaster. Some people called them demons. Others said they were God's punishment, that Europe had sinned. And this was the reckoning. The one thing every account agreed on, the one detail that never changed across any version of any story. Nobody could stop them. By 1240, Kiev was gone. A Franciscan friar named Giovanni de Pian del Carpine traveled through the region 2 years later and described what he found: not a ruined city, but an empty plain scattered with skulls. He counted bones the way you'd count stones on a road. He stopped counting. The Mongols split their forces into multiple columns and kept moving. Toward Poland, toward Hungary, toward people who had heard what happened to Kiev and still, even now, even knowing, couldn't fully accept that it was real. They were about to lose that argument. April 1241. 2 battles, 2 countries, almost the same week. In Poland, Duke Henry II of Silesia stood at Legnica with one of the most formidable armies the region could assemble: Polish knights, Teutonic knights, Knights Templar. These were men who had trained their entire adult lives for exactly this kind of engagement. Heavy cavalry, armored, experienced, confident. They had every reason to be confident. The Mongol force that met them was lighter, faster, and completely uninterested in the battle Henry thought he was fighting. The engagement began, and then the Mongols started pulling back. Not fleeing, pulling back, organized, deliberate. To the knights watching from the Polish line, it looked like hesitation, maybe fear. The order came down to pursue. They charged. The moment the Polish formation broke apart, the Mongol cavalry wheeled in 3 directions simultaneously. Smoke rolled across the battlefield, probably burning reeds, possibly a deliberate screen, and in the confusion, the communication between Polish units collapsed. The horse archers picked them apart, unit by unit, knight by knight. Duke Henry tried to escape. He didn't make it far. The Mongols caught him, killed him, cut off his head, and paraded it on a lance outside the city walls of Legnica. According to some accounts, they filled 9 large sacks with the ears of the dead before they left. But while Poland was still trying to understand what had just happened, something far larger was unfolding 400 miles to the south. King Bela IV of Hungary had spent months preparing. He knew the Mongols were coming. He'd taken the warnings seriously when others hadn't. He'd assembled somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 men at the Sarjo River. He had fortified positions. He had a plan. What he didn't have, what nobody in Europe had yet figured out, was that Subutai had already been studying him for months. The Battle of Mohi began at dawn on April 11th. The Hungarians pushed across the river and found light resistance, almost suspiciously light. It felt like momentum. It felt like they were winning. Subutai had crossed miles downstream the night before, in secret, with a separate force, while Bela's army was congratulating itself at the river. The Mongols were already behind them. What followed was not a battle. Bela's men were surrounded, compressed, slaughtered in a way that medieval chroniclers struggled to describe with words they had. The king himself escaped on horseback barely. The Mongols chased survivors for days, hunting them across fields and through forests, killing men who thought they'd already survived. Historians estimate Hungary lost somewhere between a quarter and half of its entire population in the months that followed. Western Europe was now completely exposed. And in Paris, in Rome, in the courts of the Holy Roman Empire, men who had done nothing for months were suddenly, desperately trying to figure out one question. Is there anything left that can stop them? They didn't have an answer. And the worst was still coming. Every European commander who faced the Mongols made the same mistake going in. They looked at the enemy and thought, cavalry, nomads, fast raiders. We've handled raiders before. They hadn't handled anything like this. Medieval European warfare ran on a set of assumptions so deeply embedded that most commanders didn't even recognize them as assumptions. Heavy cavalry wins pitched battles. Armor decides close combat. An army that retreats is an army that's losing. These weren't just tactics, they were instincts. Drilled in from the first day of training, confirmed by every tournament and skirmish and border war these men had ever fought. The Mongols had studied every single one of those instincts and built a system to use them as weapons against their owners. Start with what happened before any battle even began. Subutai's intelligence network was unlike anything Europe had ever encountered. For months, sometimes years, before a campaign, his agents moved through target territories, gathering information that most commanders wouldn't have thought to ask for. Not just troop numbers, political grudges between neighboring lords, which roads turned to mud in spring, where a city stored its food, which rulers were too proud to ask their neighbors for help until it was too late. By the time Subutai committed soldiers to a battlefield, he already knew how the fight would end. He was essentially running the same play twice, once in his head, once in the field. Then there was the speed. Mongol cavalry could cover 60 to 80 miles in a single day. A European heavy cavalry force, with its supply wagons and infantry support, managed perhaps 20. What this meant in practice was brutal. By the time a king received news that a city 300 miles east had fallen, the Mongols had already moved 200 miles past it. You couldn't respond to what they were doing. You could only react to where they'd already been. But here's the thing that doesn't get enough attention. The most devastating weapon wasn't the horses. It wasn't the composite bows, though those could punch through armor at 200 yards, which was horrifying enough. It wasn't even the siege engineers they'd absorbed from China and Persia, men who could reduce a fortified city to rubble in days. It was the stories. Subutai understood, with a coldness that's almost difficult to process, that a psychologically broken enemy requires far less effort to defeat than a confident one. So the Mongols engineered their own mythology. Cities that surrendered quickly were sometimes spared, that detail traveled. Cities that resisted were annihilated completely, and survivors were deliberately allowed to escape, not out of mercy, because a traumatized survivor fleeing west was more valuable than a corpse. That person would walk into the next city and do Subutai's psychological work for him. By the time the Mongols arrived somewhere new, the population had already been living inside the nightmare for weeks. The walls felt thinner. The soldiers felt smaller. The gap between what they were facing and what they could do about it felt impossible to close. And none of this was improvised. None of it was instinct. It was a system designed, tested, refined across 3 decades of warfare on 3 continents. And in the spring of 1241, it had never been closer to its greatest conquest. After Legnica and Mohi, something changed in the way Europeans talked about the Mongols. Before, it was fear, a sharp, active fear, the kind that makes you reach for a weapon or start building walls. After April 1241, it became something quieter and harder to fight, a settling. A slow acceptance that this thing could not be reasoned with, could not be outmaneuvered, could not be outlasted. King Bela IV was technically still alive, still king of Hungary. But his kingdom was a ruin. He fled from castle to castle, pursued by Mongol raiding parties who seemed to materialize out of nothing and vanish just as fast. At one point, he crossed the Adriatic and took refuge on a small fortified island off the Dalmatian coast, surrounded by open water, as isolated as he could get. Mongol scouts had already reached the Adriatic shore. They stood there and looked at the water. Reportedly, they asked local fishermen how wide it was, whether it could be crossed. They were calculating. In the West, the panic had a different texture. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, sent urgent letters to the kings of England and France. The tone wasn't diplomatic anymore, it was raw. The entire continent is at stake. Pope Gregory IX called for a crusade, which would have been remarkable enough on its own, except this crusade wasn't aimed at Jerusalem or the Holy Land. It was aimed at Eastern Europe, at the pagan horde advancing through Christian territory. But the letters went mostly unanswered. The coalitions never formed, because Frederick and the Pope were already locked in a bitter personal conflict that neither man could set aside, even with an existential threat approaching from the east. English barons were fighting their own king. French nobles didn't trust Frederick. Everyone had a reason to wait and see who moved first. Nobody moved. Meanwhile, the Mongols spent the winter of 1241 consolidating Hungary, using it not as a destination, but as a base, a staging ground. Raiding parties pushed into Austria, into Croatia, down the Dalmatian coast. Everywhere they went, they were gathering intelligence, probing fortifications, testing response times. Subutai was planning the next phase, not consolidating what he had, planning what came after: Germany, northern Italy, the Rhine, the Atlantic. The men in his command, who had ridden from Mongolia to the middle of Europe, looked west and saw no obstacle they hadn't already broken somewhere else. There was one question left, one thing that could still stop what was coming. Something did. In December of 1241, Genghis Khan died. He was 56 years old. The cause, almost certainly, was the thing that had been killing him slowly for years, a lifetime of drinking that had wrecked his liver and his Judgment in roughly equal measure. Somewhere deep in the Mongolian heartland, thousands of miles from the burning fields of Hungary, the great Khan simply stopped. The news took weeks to travel west. When it reached the campaign, it triggered something that no European army, no fortified city, no act of desperation had managed to trigger. It stopped everything. Under Mongol law, the law that Genghis himself had laid down and that no prince could ignore without risking his claim to power, the death of a great Khan required every senior royal to return home. Not eventually, immediately. The Subutai, the Grand Council that would select the next ruler, could not happen without them. And nothing, no conquest, no campaigns, no amount of momentum outranked that obligation. Batu Khan received the news and faced a decision that wasn't really a decision. He ordered the withdrawal. The Mongol armies turned east. Not because they had been beaten. Not because a European army had finally found the answer to Subutai's tactics. Not because the rivers or the mountains or the fortifications had held. They turned east because a man they had never met drank himself to death in a tent on the other side of the world, and the political machinery of an empire demanded they come home to deal with it. The withdrawal happened fast. Within weeks, the forces that had been probing Austria and Croatia and the Dalmatian coast simply pulled back. The raids stopped. The horizon cleared. People who had spent months expecting to die began cautiously to believe they might not. Europe woke up and found itself still standing, and didn't entirely know what to do with that. The survivors who came back to Hungary found villages that had ceased to exist, farms gone fallow, roads lined with bones that nobody had buried because there hadn't been enough living people left to do the burying. The trauma was deep and generational. The eastern half of Europe would carry it for decades. But France was still there. The great cathedrals of Germany were still standing. The kingdoms west of the Rhine had been terrified, had written frantic letters, had prayed, and had been saved by something that had nothing to do with any of it. Luck. The liver of a man they had never heard of, failing at the precise moment it needed to fail. History works like that sometimes, and it's uncomfortable to sit with, the idea that civilization doesn't always survive because of its strength or its values or its will to resist. Sometimes it survives because the right person dies in the right tent at the right time. Historians have spent centuries asking the question that has no clean answer. What if Urgide had lived another 5 years? Would Subutai have reached the Rhine, the Atlantic coast? Would there have been a renaissance, or would that entire chapter of human history exist only as a story the Mongols told about a civilization they once erased? We don't know. We genuinely, honestly don't know. What we do know is this. In the spring and summer of 1241, Europe came closer to total collapse than it has ever fully admitted. The armies failed. The walls didn't hold. The coalitions never materialized. Every system that was supposed to protect the continent looked at the Mongols and came up short. Europe wasn't saved by strength. It was saved by accident. And the thing about accidents is you can't plan for the next one.